back. Today we're going to have a look at how to compose complex plots using views. Many times we might want to have a plot that has several subplots within it, plots that have insets, plots that are similar and arranged in a grid. These are called small multiples. And there's several different ways to accomplish these types of constructions in views. We're going to look at using the grid system and also how we can use overlays to create insets in views. To do that, we're going to work from the data that we used for our divided bar chart. To remind you what that looked like, it looked like this. Here we were looking at the top 5 medal winners in the Tokyo Olympics for bronze, silver, and gold medals. We had constructed this by overlaying multiple bar charts to give us this particular chart shown here. Again, we didn't worry about labeling it, nor did we worry about many of the design issues that are present here. Instead, we're just focusing on how do we attain a plot, knowing that we can go back and refine it later once we have the plot that we're trying to make. Today, we're going to look at how we might tell this story a little bit different by making what's known as small multiples of this. So rather than needing to compare between sizes of bars that are far apart and also don't share a common baseline, what we oftentimes might consider doing to make this easier to look at is to plot the total wins and then have separate plots for bronze, silver, and gold that allow easier comparison. How do we do that and how do we arrange them? Well, the easiest way to do that here is to use the grid system in views. So let's have a look. We're going to make a new page, which we get by clicking on this button here. Within this, we are going to set up a grid. The grid system is the next button over. If I click on this, I get grid 1. Within this, we have properties and formatting. The formatting gives us margins just like we normally would have for a regular graph. So if I click on graph, you can see there's also margins. So we have those when we're within a grid system. We also have properties such as zero margins, which will set the margins inside the grid to 0. We'll see that later in this video. We also can specify how many rows and columns are present inside of this grid, and we'll see how that works. We can change the row scalings we want and the column scalings if we want. And we'll also see that as well. To start with, let's just think about the fact that what we want is to have 4 different graphs. Graphs that show us the total medal winners, and then graphs that show us also the bronze, silver, and gold winners. If we were to set this up, what we would want to do then is make first a base graph. Inside of that, we would then set up a plot that has bars. And I could go through and set this all up, but I think an easier way to do this is to actually delete this and use something that's formatted the way we want it already, which is here. So I'll just say copy and paste. Now I have this graph inside of the grid system. I don't really need the bronze, silver, and gold medal winners necessarily, so let's just go ahead and get rid of those as well and just stay with the bronze. What we're interested in is something that says total, and so I'm going to rename graph 1 as total medals. This is no longer bronze but total. That's okay. I'll just say graph for now because it's already named total medals up here. I don't really need this to be this color at this point. I'd rather have it be something a little bit more neutral. We've used gray for silver, so let's use something that's a little bit darker, like tungsten or lead, for the fill of these bars so that they look different from the other colors we have. Now I have the total medals. If I'd like to add another graph to this grid system, I can just copy and paste it. And now you'll see I have another graph within this grid, right? And if I open and close the grid, I'll see the graphs that are there. It's placed it to the side. Let's go ahead and make this the gold medals. I can go in and I can change this from total medals to gold count. And then I can go and also change the color here to be that darker sort of banana or cantaloupe color if we want. Now we have the gold bars. I can repeat this process for both silver and bronze. So I'll just put those both in. You can see it's giving me 3 plots, 2 by 1. And the reason is that this grid system is set up to be 2 by 2. So it's just filling it out. I'll hit paste again to add the 4th. And then now I can go in and say this plot will be our silver plot. This plot will be our bronze plot. Then we go in and we do the same thing we'd done before. In silver, I could say instead of gold count, I want silver count. Instead of this color, I want something like silver. Okay. Then under bronze, same thing. Instead of gold count, I want bronze count. And then instead of this color, I want the color we had chosen for bronze, which I believe was tangerine in the last video. So now I have gold, silver, bronze, and total. I could give these titles if I want, and it's fairly easy to do this now. I go ahead and insert a label, and I say total. Then I want this maybe at the top of here, and so for the X positions, I have 50. For the Y positions, let's put this at 1, so it's at the top. Let's go ahead and set this horizontal alignment to center. Then what I can do is just copy and paste this into each separate plot if I want, calling this instead of total, gold, instead of silver, or instead of total here, silver, and then here I also have bronze. We could of course go through and also color code these. I'm not going to go ahead and do that for a very long amount of time, but we can see that I have choices in these colors the same way I normally would, and so I could also color this font if I wanted to match so that we would have that color coding. Again, I'm not going to worry about that too much here. I just want to focus on how we organize this. Something you'll notice is that there's only 3 labels, and the reason is that there's not enough room anymore. This is taking up too much space, and part of the reason is that in our grid we have margins. I don't need the margins out here like I did before, so let's just go ahead and set all of these to 0. I'm just going to say copy and paste to make my life easy, to make it fast. Whoops. Now you'll also see that there's an internal margin that started at 0. That sets the margin between the plots. So if I wanted to, I could go ahead and say like 1 centimeter, and it will push the plots farther apart. Let's go back to 0 centimeters for now. Now I have something where I can read each one of these bars. I have total, gold, silver, and bronze. One thing, however, is that we might think that the total, the gold, the silver, and the bronze should all be on top of each other and easy to read. So how do we change that? I can go into the grid system and say instead of 2 rows, I want 4. And I don't want 2 columns, I want 1. And now these are stacked. Of course, they're sort of hard to read because they're too squished, and that's largely because the page is not high enough. So if I go back to page 2, I can change this height to something that will work a little bit better. How about instead of 6.8 centimeters, let's make it roughly 2.5 times taller, and we'll just change this to inches. If I go back and say view, zoom to page, we'll see everything. And now it all kind of looks reasonable and easy to read. I have total, gold, silver, and bronze stacked on top of each other, relatively straightforward to see what's happening. Of course, total's cut off. Again, we're not going to worry too much about this. If we really wanted to be able to see it, I could just set the top margin to be a little bit bigger. How about 0.1 centimeters? And now I'll be able to read all of total. That works well. And so that's a reason why we want control over the margins of the grid. What else might we want to do? Well, rather than repeating elements over and over again, like what the x-axis numbers are, how could we make it so that we don't see that? One way, of course, would be to go in and to hide these axes, but it also sort of leaves a gap between these plots. And so let's not do that. Let's see what else we can do. I'm going to copy and paste this entire grid system so that we can go back and see where we've come from if we want to. Now in this page 3, under grid, what I could use is 0 margins. Let's see what happens. What I've lost is all the information between the different plots. What happened there? I didn't change the margins on the grid. What I changed was the margins on each plot inside the grid, and those are set to 0. So that's what 0 margins does. It sets all the margins on the inside to 0. I don't see the labels anymore, and if I want to get those back, what I should do is just go in and give margins now to the actual grid. And then I can do what we had before. The top margin we already have. The bottom margin, let's set this as 1.5 centimeters. And now we have a situation where all of these plots share the same x-axis, and we're not repeating that over and over again. Of course, our labeling doesn't work out so great, and so we can always choose to fix that if we wanted to. We could go in and we could just say, rather than having the label be at the top, the label like this could be oriented with the vertical alignment at the top. And now it's dropped it down into the plot that we wish to label. So that's one way. Again, we don't need to spend too much time on this, but you can see that now I have small multiples where it's easier to directly compare gold, silver, and bronze. What else might we do here? Well, one thing that I liked about what was happening up here was that the different metals added up to the total. And that's, I think, how many of us think about what's going on. It was hard to compare between different values and know instantly who was the largest silver, the second largest silver, and so on. Whereas in the plot that we have just made, that's pretty straightforward. But what we've lost is this idea of things growing step by step and adding together. So how could we recreate that? One way would be to use a second grid. And so we can have nested grids inside of views. Let's start back here. And what we have perhaps then would be, or what we might be interested in having, is a grid where we have one plot that is the total metals, and then a series of 3 plots below where we are essentially adding together bronze, silver, and gold. And by doing that, then we can watch them march across the screen the same way that we have here. What that really means is having a grid that is 1 column by 2 rows, and then in that second row to have another grid that is 3 columns. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. Essentially, I have this grid already. I'm saying I would like this to be 2 rows and 1 column. Vuesz only really follows this advice here if it's possible for it to do so. Here, it's saying I have 4, I'm just going to put them in somewhere, and you've said there's 1 column, so I'm going to keep them stacked. But we'll get around that in just a moment. I want to introduce a new grid, which is added down here, so it's just simply added a 5th plot down below. And then I want this to be, instead of 2 rows, 1 row, and instead of 2 columns, 3 columns. And now what I can do is I can simply put each one of these down below into this new grid. And you can see I'm essentially building up what I talked about, something at the top with individual bars down at the bottom. They're not really aligned, and part of the reason they're not aligned is because we have this here with its own margins, and this here with its own margins, the grid, and then within the grid, the bronze also has its own margins. And so in order to try to simplify this, what we could do is go back to grid 1 and say 0 margins. You can see what it's done when I say 0 margins is it zeroed the margins on this plot. But when I look here at the grid, it didn't touch that. So we need to go in and say manually that I want each one of these to be 0 centimeters. That still hasn't lined things up with the edge here, because each one of these plots has its own margins. So I can go in here and say 0 margins again, and now we get to a case where these are lined up. I still can't see the labels, and we know why. It's because we need margins. So I can go to this grid and say this left margin would be 2 centimeters, And then the right margin would be 0.1 centimeters. The top margin is 0.1, although I think we decided we needed something like 0.25 to be able to see that top label. And then the bottom was 1.5 centimeters. Now we have something that's beginning to look a little bit more reasonable. One thing that's happened is I don't see the labels anymore on each one of these, and that's somewhat okay. And the reason we don't see them is because we're cutting them off, because this grid here has 0 margins. You can see if I brought back in that margin, these labels would exist yet again. So one way to make sure that we line these up is to give then this also left margin of 2 centimeters and go back to grid 1 and give it a left margin of 0 centimeters. So there is a little bit of playing around to make sure that everything lines up appropriately. Once we do that, things are starting to look a little bit better. Before we had made this tall because we needed to fit 4 plots in a row. Now we just have 2 plots, but then 3 across. And so I'm actually going to go back in and say maybe what I want this to be is something like 6 inches by 4 inches. And now maybe I get something that looks a little bit more reasonable. I can do what we had talked about before, where this goes to the top, this also goes to the top, and this goes to the top. And now everything's labeled appropriately. We can see what's going on. One thing that's a little different is that these axes are all the same, but I can't quite tell what's happening because this runs from whatever number we have out to say 120. Why can't I see this? Same problem we encountered before, which is that our second grid here has 0 margins. I need the bottom margin to have some space in order to see the numbers that we have. And so I'd go there, I'd go back to here, and I'd say this bottom margin is 0 centimeters. Again, playing around just a little bit with what's going on. This is not the same scale as here. This runs from 0 to 120, 0 to 120, 0 to 120, whereas the top goes from 0 to 120. So I should show this again so that the scales are recognizable, that I can see that I'm repeating this 3 times and that this one here is separate. There are several different ways you might do this, but I think the easiest is to be in grid 1, which encompasses all of this, and just add an internal margin of 1.5, let's say, centimeters to keep it the same as what we have on the spacing down here. Now I can see this axis separate from this axis. They don't have labels, but that's okay. That's something we would add in later if we wanted to make something publishable. I'd go in and say this is metal camera. And then I do the same for all of these. This is squished in enough that it's blocking the numbers, and so one way to handle that is to go back into the grid, make this a little bit bigger. And then eventually you'll see it will become wide enough that I can have this metal count show up. One of the reasons that I had to make this so big is because the internal margin is pushing the top and the bottom apart equally. What I really want to do is just create space on the bottom of this. So maybe rather than having this have an internal margin of 2 centimeters, I can go back to the plot that we have here and say, the thing that we set to 0, I'm just kidding, I wanted this to be 2 centimeters. And now you can see that appears. And in fact, I could probably get away with 1.5 centimeters, just like we had for the lower plots. Great. Now I have something that looks pretty nice. I have the metal counts, I have the bronze, the silver, and the gold, and they're marching across. One thing that you might like to change, however, of course, is that the scales don't quite add up. This bar is shorter than it would be up here. And the way to get around that is to realize, essentially, that each of these should be 1/3 the size of this. I know from looking at the data, which we can see here, that one of the silver counts is 41, which means that the shortest we're really ever going to want our small individual x-axes to be is 42, so that we can see the end of it. So if I click on this, I could say what I want this to go to is 42, what I want this to go to is 42, and what I want this to go to is 42. That's Then 42 plus 42 plus 42 is really 126. And now I have a plot where the length of the bars added together really is the length of this bar shown here. There are a few things that one might want to change. For instance, the thickness of this bar is a little bit thinner than the thickness of these bars. And that's simply because we have a plot here and a plot here, but this plot is squished up a little bit, while the plot down here maybe isn't. One way around that is to go back into grid 1 and use the row scalings. So right now the default is 1 to 1. That won't change anything. If I set this to 2 to 1, you would see that the top plot will become large and the bottom plots will become small. You can also see that we had covered up the labels and they're starting to appear here again. And that's something that we could worry about, but in order just to clean this up a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and hold down Command or Apple, depending on if you have a Mac or a PC, and just say, I don't want to see these right now. We know what they mean, and we're just exploring the capabilities of the grid system. This is overkill, and so really maybe what we want is just something like 1.1 to 1. And now this is just a little bit wider, starting to be about in parity with this. You can of course use math if you happen to know what the relative size is in terms of the height of these y-axes to this y-axis to exactly put in what the scaling should be to get things to be precise. We're not going to worry about that too much. Again, I'm just trying to show you the capabilities. The last thing that I would like to discuss here is what if we wanted an inset? Here we're using small multiples to create a plot like we're showing here. But sometimes all we want is like just a little inset here. For instance, what if all we cared about in all of this was just the number of gold medals, for instance? How could we do that? Let's go back up to this plot where we have everything of interest and copy and paste it again and think about what we would change in order to get a plot with an inset that makes sense. Effectively, we don't really need our grid system anymore. Let's say we wanted to represent the total metals and then have an inset of the gold metals. What I could do is move this out of the grid system so I have something large as shown here. One thing you'll notice is that even though this is large, I'm seeing all the labels from the other plots, and that's because Vuesz is just trying to draw everything. Remember, the thing that's on top is the thing that gets drawn on top of our visual stack. And so gold metals is hiding everything else. If I were to hide this for a moment, then I'd see everything that's down below it. I'm going to show this again. This is blocking it because also inside of our graph we have a fill that is white of our plot area. I could also hide that and we would see the bars behind it. That's not something we want to do right now, but I just want to point that out. What I'd like to do then is have gold somehow be an inset down in here somewhere. And so one way to do that, now that we understand what's happening, is that I can move gold up and up again. Gold gets plotted on top and I can no longer see total metals. However, we do know that what I could do is just say hide to its background color for that plot, and I would see the total metals down below. It's starting to look almost like how we built up our divided bar chart. But what we're going to do now is I'm just going to change the size of this plot. And I could do that by going in and changing its margins. But an easier way for right now is to just click and drag on one of these corners and resize this. And now I basically have drawn an inset. I don't need what else is on this grid, so let's just go ahead and delete that. I think it's kind of silly to have this be so tall and skinny now. So let's just go back and change the page size to be back in terms of centimeters. This is now too small, but that's okay. I can go in and I can select the gold plot and I can move it around however I like in order to get something that fits a little bit better within the space I've left myself for this inset. You can see that I'm going to have a few problems with labeling. It's not going to be super clear. Again, this is not exactly what we're aiming for here, is to try to get the most clear plot, just to show you how one might go about creating these sorts of insets that you often see in different publications. We'd obviously want to rescale this. We said maybe 42, but I could look at the data and think I'm actually just showing the gold medals. The highest gold medal count is 39, so why don't I just have this run instead to 40. When I come back in, it makes the bars a little bit easier to see, and I could move this around ever so slightly to try to get a plot that fits just a little bit better in terms of how the inset works. I'm going to leave it here because we don't have to wait for or play around forever to get this to work. We know there's major problems here with alignment. We know there's problems with overlap and legibility, but hopefully what I've shown you is how to make an inset. And the easiest way is to just have two things on the same level where you draw one over the top of the other and then position that to be where you want. And again, all we've done is really adjusted the margins so that we have a huge left margin, 7.148 centimeters, with respect to the page width, which is only 9 centimeters. And so that's what's happening when you grab these black boxes and drag them around like this, is that you're just changing the margins. We could go ahead and make this look better, but for now, I think what we've seen over the course of this video is how to handle making complex plots. We've started with a plot like this, realizing that it might look better if we had multiple instances, so we made what's called small multiples. We learned how to manipulate the margins within the grid system that held these small multiples so that we can get something that looks a bit cleaner with less chart junk and repeating of elements as seen here. We've also seen that we can have grids with inside of grids, and that allows us then to create plots that look like this, where we have a single element and then other elements spaced underneath it. And then finally we've seen that we can avoid grids if we want to and use instead just overlapping elements to create insets like we're used to seeing. And that shows some of the power of views. It allows us to easily and quickly create plots, complex plots with many elements where the elements are aligned and spaced exactly how we want them to be. It allows us to copy and paste elements that we like in order to rapidly assemble these types of complex plots. And it allows us to follow guidelines like alignment and proximity easily while creating these types of plots. And so with that, we're done looking at the grid system, and I hope you have a good time using views to make some more complex plots as you move forward.